Welcome to Dhamma on the Sidewalk, insights, interviews, and practical tips on the teachings of the Buddha for people of all walks of life, attuning, exploring, integrating the teachings in everyday life. Simple Dhamma for daily life. I'm Asoka, hosting Dhamma Capsule for people like you. Hello and welcome to Dhamma on the Sidewalk. I'll start by wishing you a good and pleasant year 2024. May it be smooth, healthy, safe, and keep you contented. The following conversation with Ayya Yeshe is rich and brings up a number of important, and I would rather say critical issues of our contemporary world. Ayya is very straightforward. It is possible to develop empathy and compassion. She has done this in a very radical way since an early age, helping and supporting the betterment of the livelihoods of underprivileged population is what keeps her purpose alive. Expressing compassion in action, fierce compassion, radical compassion, with concrete and practical steps. She's done that in India for over 15 years, and she continues to do so out of her monastery in Tasmania. She speaks quite well about a number of critical topics on Buddhism, the evolution of Buddhism, the consideration of gender issues within Buddhist schools, across all Buddhist schools, how Buddhism can help us see the reality of the other people's suffering, and therefore our possibility and our potential to help, sometimes it's very small steps. So I leave the floor to her, and I hope that the inspiration that I have always nurtured for Ayya transpires a bit for you as well. So let's listen to Ayya. Ayya, welcome to Dhamma on the Sidewalk. How are you this morning?
I'm doing well, thank you.
And I understand you're about to come to India. Is it a regular visit you're doing in India?
Yeah, I spend 3 months a year in India working with Bodhicitta Foundation, the charity I founded in central India.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, I lived 17 years on and off in India, but now, because I've started a monastery in Australia as well, I move between both countries.
And the Bodhicitta Foundation in India what is its primary focus? Is it literacy, education, poverty eradication in health services? Can you elaborate a bit on that foundation?
So our focus is women and children, because people most impacted by poverty are women and children.
Mm-hmm.
So that manifests in different programs like a girls' home for vulnerable teenage girls from remote villages or rescued from child labour or brothels,
mm-hmm.
to help them get an education, train them as social workers, and send them back or help them start new lives, and offer 500 hours of volunteering as a social worker. So they start satellite centres to empower other women. We have a women's job training centre that trains women in 3-month courses in computers, English, sewing, and beauty therapies, because beauty therapies is a very big industry in India with weddings and so forth. And then we sponsor 55 children for school. We have 4 study centres, 3 hours a day, to supplement the poor level of education available in Indian public schools, which supports about 170 children. And we also make 7,000 meals per year for hungry children. Yeah, and we also offer counselling, legal advice for women in domestic violence situations, and retreats and Sunday schools for children.
And is this a intervention that you had started when you were living in India during the 17 years you lived in India, or did it start recently?
It started about 15 years ago in central India. Yeah, and I lived in that area for 12 years with the people themselves.
So this is what you call the compassion in action, or that's where the root of your very nice expression, which is compassion is a muscle that needs to have constant training, is this exposure to the hardship of some of the groups in India in particular. And that's where your focus as a nun has always been devoted to?
Absolute yes to the compassionism, a very important part of Dharma. My journey started at the age of 17 in India when I traveled to India and Nepal in search of the meaning of life. And I had a lot of, depression because my father had died. And I just didn't see a lot of meaning or happiness in the society I was living in, mm-hmm. Geared towards like the purpose of life being individual pleasure and profit. And then I found Dharma, and, I was really transformed by that experience to realize that one could purify one's mind, and one didn't have to take every thought that enters one's mind absolutely seriously. Like one has suffering, one is not suffering it. And that there is a basic goodness or a luminous awareness that is underlying our confusion, that when our confusion is swept away, our basic nature is goodness.
Yes.
So I became very interested in pursuing Dharma practice and the goal of enlightenment. I studied with a Lama and ordained at 23.
So you ordained first in the Tibetan tradition, right?
I did, yeah. I just found there was no support. Like I wanted to start a monastery and I wanted to pursue Dharma practice full time, but there literally was nowhere for Western women in my tradition. I ordained with 15 people and only 2 of us are left. Mm-hmm. And I just really hit the patriarchal glass ceiling, because Tibetan men have support. They have a lot of resources, especially Tibetan Rinpoches. They're millionaires. Mm. Not, of course, the average Tibetan refugee is still living in hardship, and that's a totally different thing. But the people in charge of Tibetan Buddhism are no longer poor, and there are hundreds of monasteries for men. There's just nothing for Western women, which is so ironic, because non-Himalayan women are the biggest supporters of Tibetan Buddhism. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I really had to just find my own way or disrobe. Wow. And I just chose to be stubborn. And, so I met a nun called Ajahn Tanasanti from Amaravati. Mm-hmm. And she just kind of let me know about how monks and nuns should be living in the Vinaya, and what the Buddha intended for monks and nuns, that we shouldn't just be surplus labor for lay Buddhist centers and charge money to stay there, that there's a long Buddhist tradition of valuing renunciates who act as a force of holding space for community, offering spiritual comfort, and embodying the full-time pursuit and realization of Dharma and preserving the teachings. Mm-hmm. And this is how Buddhism has been preserved through the centuries. Not to say that lay people haven't, or householder yogis haven't contributed a great deal as well. And of course they can get enlightened, but they just have more busy lives, so monastics act as a focus to preserve the teachings and the Buddha's way of life. But this understanding is really crucially missing in the way most Westerners are approaching Buddhism. There are actually very few monasteries. There is actually very little awareness of the value of the fourfold Sangha, meaning lay women, lay men, nuns and monks.
Yes.
And how living in precepts preserves the Dharma. So I found myself just living in garden sheds and hanging out on my mother's couch and living in Theravadan centers because they actually do value and support monastics. And so I had to kind of just cobble together a training and a life as a monastic. But I determined to live on faith. And because the first day I ordained, I had to take off my robes and go to work in an office. And I neither had the freedom of a layperson nor the training of a monastic. I neither had the freedom and benefits of either. There's no context for ordaining. Like, why stay ordained when a Dharma center is charging you money and they're not valuing you and they're using your labor? And, I found like the Western monastics in our Dharma center were running the center and doing all the work, but the Lama was taking all the glory and the respect, and people would bring in food and make offerings, but he didn't carry on that ancient tradition of supporting us, which was his duty as an abbot. It's very disappointing, that reification of, Tibetan men, that ethnocentrism is deeply harmful to the future of the Dharma in the West. Not to say that, and when I say Westerners, I mean anyone of any race who has grown up here and has Western liberal values, who is part of this society. You need people from your own country to take on and embody the Dharma, not just reifying Asian males, I mean, if women are the main practitioners and supporters of Buddhism, there's got to be some kind of depression that develops in your mind. If the only people you see on the podium are men, you don't see anyone reflected like yourself. Like you start to doubt your own capacity for awakening, your own value.
There is an interview of yours I listened to recently. You spoke about doubting about being a second-class citizen. In sense of being unvalued, unappreciated, unsupported. And so what you're describing there was in an Eastern setting, right? You're not talking about Australian context at this moment.
No, I'm absolutely referring to the Western context. We have, and both countries, it's pervasive, it's patriarchy. Right. And it happens to Himalayan nuns and it happens to non-Himalayan nuns. It's patriarchy, and it means for thousands of years women have been excluded from the spiritual traditions they are the main practitioners and supporters of. They have been placed as second-class citizens in their own spiritual practice and traditions.
In the Theravada tradition, there are also quite a number of constraints for women to ordain, for women to be recognized, for women move out from the Mechi, for instance, from the Mechi ordination level. So I'm kind of curious. You mentioned that you feel more safe in a Theravadan context. However, that is also a context that presents constraints with regard to women's being ordained.
So what we have is Theravada has the strangler vine of patriarchy preventing women from progressing and recognizing what the Buddha actually laid down, which was very radical for the axial age. But at least they have a place to live and food to eat and shelter and an identity, whereas Western monastics in Tibetan Buddhism have zero shelter. They don't even have the basic requisites of food, shelter, robes, medicine. And without that, monastic life isn't possible. They're literally, forced to live like lay people, work in a job and live in a paradigm where they're an unpaid worker for a lay Dharma center, and all the Dharma, all the training is geared towards lay people. The whole routine is geared towards lay people, and they have no monastic training, and they burn out. They're probably working an outside job, and they're probably working 20 or 30 hours in the Dharma center. Yeah, they have the constraints of celibacy, but they don't have a sangha that understands and appreciates what the purpose of being a monastic is. And it's not to be free labor just for lay Dharma centers. It's actually to be an object of refuge and hold space and practice and study full time Theravada also has a problem with patriarchy. At least it has a context for monastic life to be possible. In Tibet, Tibetans do support monastics. They do follow the Vinaya in their own way. The Tibetan lamas who have refugee trauma and who think of Westerners as this kind of having this unending source of wealth, which is clearly a misunderstanding of how how our capitalist societies operate. That system of support broke down because they are in preservation mode of their own culture. Their own culture is endangered, or it was 30 or 40 years ago before they established hundreds of monasteries. So their priority was to establish their own monasteries and preserve their own culture. But there's now, so many hundreds of monasteries for men in India and surrounding Himalayan countries. It's not in danger anymore, and therefore they need to step up and take responsibility for those they ordain. But that understanding of valuing monastics and the fourfold Sangha and actually doing more than just being an individual practitioner has not been transmitted to Westerners, and it is a fatal flaw that could lead to the complete erasure of monastics from Tibetan Buddhism and monastics having a future in the West.
You have, I understand you, beside the Tibetan tradition you ordained under, you also joined the Plum Village, so Thich Nhat Hanh, as well as Ajahn Brahm from the forest tradition in Australia. Am I correct?
I mean, I didn't just, bounce around different traditions. What I did was spend the first 5 years of my Buddhist career training with an individual Kempo or Geshe. Then when I found there was no support, I was forced to leave, move around to different temples, mostly Theravadan ones. But I continued to study in Tibetan Buddhism, like mostly full-time for about 15 years. But what I did do was supplement my Tibetan Buddhist practice with Vinaya training from the Theravada tradition because it wasn't available and it was lacking in Tibetan Buddhism. And, so many texts in Tibetan Buddhism haven't been translated. So it's very hard to find that kind of training. And then I became, one of my mentors is a Theravadan monk, Bhante Sujato. He's a Pali scholar.
Yeah.
So then I became quite interested, and he's also a feminist and has done a lot to help revive full ordination for women in Theravada. So I became very interested in the early teachings of the Buddha, and I actually found there was no contradiction, that one led naturally to the other. One is the foundation of the other. And in fact, if you really want to be a good Buddhist, you should understand Theravada first in order to progress, if you so wish, to go more into the Bodhisattva line.
It's really interesting to read, to hear, because it's a reflection I made to myself as well, and discovering studying and living in the monastery, Theravada monasteries, and having access really to the text and Dhamma talks, really, but coming from a Mahayana tradition. So myself, in terms of practice, I was like, really? This is the root of everything. So hearing that from you, I kind of remove a self-doubt I started to have.
You feel validated, sister?
That's good. Yeah. No random encounter. Anyway, so keep going. Sorry, I have interrupted.
So I took full ordination. I practiced with I've always liked Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings as well, because he is one of the earliest practitioners of engaged Buddhism. Yeah. And I was always interested in engaged Buddhism. I was a street kid, and, I've had some challenging circumstances in my life that have really made me understand the importance of basic human rights and justice and the welfare state. So I found his teachings deeply profound, and when I thought, where should I go for full ordination, which isn't available in Tibetan Buddhism, I went to Plum Village and took full ordination, but kept my own robes and still practiced Tibetan Buddhism, even though I was a little bit tempted, and I went back there last year, and I spent a few months in total in the Plum Village Sangha. and have friends in that tradition. And I also spent quite a few months in Bhante Sujaru's monastery and feel quite comfortable in Theravadan pro-full ordination monasteries. But I guess the Bodhisattva ideal was something that I still found deeply appealing.
The Bodhisattva ideal is not contradictory with, actually, it's fully immersed into engaged Buddhism. It does branch out. It's often it's just a matter of observation. I've been hearing often say engaged Buddhism is just a branch of Buddhism where it gathers all those who want to be having a more political intervention or like Martin Luther King. Socially engaged Buddhism is not necessarily something that has to stand out on its own. It's fully there. Every one of us can do this. It's part also, even the Theravada, it's part also of the generosity of the heart, and it has to do with, it might not be called compassion in action in Theravada tradition, but it has a certain extension of the generosity of our own intervention. What do you have to say about this? Compassion in action?
I think there's this misunderstanding, an emphasis in the way Westerners pick up Buddhism in both Theravada and Mahayana, that it becomes the hero's journey and romantic philosophy rather than about making a better life for the individual, rather than an understanding that if you have an experience of the sacred, you start to understand that we are in fact all interconnected. And Buddhists would call this interbeing, that I don't just live alone. I don't live in a vacuum. I am a dependent arising. And what I do affects others, and what others do affects me. Everything I have comes from others. My body was given to me by my parents and my genetic ancestors. The fact that I grow up in a country that has democracy is because other people have sacrificed their lives in the cause of democracy. The fact that I was a child who went to school and didn't work in a mine is because somebody actually advocated for child rights and universal education. The fact that I can read and write, the fact that I didn't starve to death, everything.
Yep.
The fact that I have a warm jacket in winter is because of someone else, that I drive on a road made by someone else. I live in a house made by someone else. I live on money offered by others, So everything, the religion I practice was kept alive by others, So everything I have draws me into this relationship with all of life, including the earth and the elements, So our very existence is an act of cooperation, and therefore this idea that Buddhism is just about sitting alone and your own salvation and, screw the world because you can't fix it, just focus on yourself. It's such a myth, because you actually look for the self and you can't find it. So, like pursuing the self or pursuing like self-satisfaction is such a dead end, because, you look into yourself and you see emptiness is fullness. Like emptiness is just not nothing. Emptiness means all of heaven and earth is part of you, and therefore happiness isn't just a personal matter. It's a communal matter. And if you look at a monastery in Asia, it is almost like a community organization, because the older people go there for something to do, and they volunteer in the kitchen and they have a bit of a gossip and they laugh a bit, and then they do some meditation, but they do it in a very unpretentious, humble way, which is so beautiful. And then if somebody loses their job, they'll go to the temple and they'll eat, and then they'll just work in the kitchen or the garden to supplement, so they don't starve to death, and they actually learn some Dharma. And if there was an orphan, that orphan would go and become a monk or a nun and get an education. The monastery was, and it was also a place where rich people gave their excess money, so that money was redistributed to, all the vulnerable people and the older people and the orphans and the seekers who were practicing there. So it was completely a community enterprise. So it was never just about the individual leaving behind society and abandoning everybody in this goal of liberation. It was, we are practicing together as a community. We are walking this road of awakening, and no monk ever got enlightened without the help of others, and very few good monks or nuns left others behind, because we see this interbeing, we see this mutuality, this reciprocity, and when you practice, you get this sense of, oh my God, I'm alive. It's a gift. And I'm so grateful to be here. And others are precious. Others are a miracle, so this kindness, this appreciation, this gratitude, this humility, this interconnectedness, this compassion, just fills you up if your practice if you're really practicing in the right way. So actually kindness and helping others, in whatever way appears before you according to your karma and according to your inclination, it's a natural outcome of spiritual practice,
I mean, what is the actual observation in terms of daily life in Australia, where you're based, when you're saying that there's a sort of veiled or misunderstanding of how in the West, so I guess when you say in the West, you mean the West in general, whether it is Europe, US, Australia, I mean, out of Eastern countries. What would be a way to start deconstructing this misunderstanding? You're the best person to ask this question, in terms of you've been so engaged in doing things for others, as well as developing your own practice. So I'm very honored to actually have this conversation with you, because I'm very much inspired by all that you've been doing and all that I know you're doing. And I'm sure that there is a lot more that I don't know about. And where are we going with this Buddhism practice, whether it is Tibetan or Theravada? Where are we going? Somehow from now on, it's like a Pandora's box of perception of what Buddhism is, how to practice it, and how the seated practice is the root or anything, or if compassion in action means. Can you just disentangle all of this for us?
Okay, so first I should just clarify that now I'm a non-sectarian Buddhist, because I just realized that patriarchy and abuse was so tightly woven into Tibetan Buddhism that there was no way forward for me as a Western nun to seeing this abuse and be helpless to do anything about it, and realizing that the leadership had no interest in empowering women. So I call myself non-sectarian in Mahayana, which is a fusion of Theravada and Tibetan Buddhism. So in terms of, the future of Buddhism and this overemphasis on the individual, we need practice, because it's like, if you don't feel happy and if you don't feel freedom and liberated and actually get a real taste of experiential interbeing, then there is not a lot of difference between you and a Christian social worker who's doing good deeds because of some kind of theistic or merely intellectual idea of goodness and benevolence, But when you actually practice and you really experience freedom, and you really see the self is like a rope hanging from a tree that you call a snake, and you see the snake as a rope and not a self, life lightens up, and the burden of suffering becomes less, and the chokehold of the self, of this, mental talk, and this person who suffers and who we think we are, and all our trauma, which is significant and shouldn't be underestimated, and that's really what stops people feeling joy and freedom and doing good things, because they're bogged down in their own survival. And it's happening even more now with the crisis of living and climate change, and the next generation being extremely underpaid and overextended, that you can feel despair, and you feel suffering, and you feel disconnected, and you feel anxiety about the future of the world. Like, none of these things should be dismissed as to why people cling to themselves, because their suffering as an unenlightened person is real and relatively legitimate. And a lot of us, there's so many bad things going on in the world, that one can't help but feel sadness and despair. And I actually was speaking to Bhikkhu Bodhi last week. I was like, Bhante, you need to write an article about hope, because I feel like, there's a lot of despair, and legitimately so, because we're driving off this precipice of climate change, and we're not taking our foot off the accelerator, or those of us who are taking our foot off the accelerator are not in the driver's seat. You know, the pathological consumption and corporations and greed-driven, you know, short-term, let's just get a 4-year good return for our company, that mentality, even if it means we rip down the Amazon and, you know, use slave labor and keep using oil and fund foreign wars, you know, like it's a very short-term profit before humanity mentality, like the logic of the cancer cell. There's so many reasons to suffer and feel anxious and cling to yourself with fear. And then to counter that, there is this culture of distraction and narcissism and vanity and kind of, I'm an online influencer and look at this fantasy world I've created for myself so that I don't have to think about climate change and poverty and my friends living in tents and something, you know, I'm just going to think about, the latest decor and the latest makeup and or obsess about my identity as our democracy is deconstructed. Yeah, these problems are significant. So practice is actually an important part of deconstructing this self-obsession. But the problem is when people have a merely intellectual approach and they use Buddhism to reinforce their self-obsession, and it becomes all about rationalism and not about resting in the heart. And it's particularly a young man thing, I have to say, I see. There is this kind of, you know, Buddhism from the neck up. Like there's no heart there. Like there's, you know, I know all these suttas and I can quote these things, but if women knock on the door and want to be equal to us, forget that because, you know, I'm not going to let you into my ivory tower. There's no heart there, you know, because actually what they're doing is putting their suffering, they're spiritually bypassing and they're putting their suffering and their desire and their anxiety and their trauma into deep freeze. And we see, you know, we saw that the weak underbelly of patriarchy exposed about how the knee-jerk reaction of some monks to simply reviving what the Buddha himself laid down, you know, thousands of years ago, you know. So it's not a new thing, it's an ancient thing. So in terms of how do we do it, it's no easy thing. But I think, you know, conservative Buddhists I meet say, well, I can't do much for the world if I'm not enlightened. So I must get enlightened first and then I can benefit others.
And what is enlightenment? And what is enlightenment?
Well, that's a question. That's a whole podcast. I mean, you know, conventional enlightenment is the end of delusion, the end of self-grasping, the purification of karma, the end of rebirth. And, you know, Mahayana and Theravada have a different definition of that in itself anyway. But, yeah, but the problem is that enlightenment can take lifetimes and people are suffering right now. I don't think it takes that much to just develop a little bit of empathy and to look at yourself and what you have and how that connects in with others, and how if you're in a war-torn country or if your daughter can't walk down the street without being raped, that affects your well-being and that affects the flourishing of Dharma. You know, so if you want Dharma to flourish, if you found value in Dharma, if you want other people to share in this inner peace, there needs to be equal access for men and women and non-binary people. There needs to be safe spaces for queer people and accessibility for poor people. Because a lot of the Dharma available in America is very much the upper middle way, you know, in terms of accessibility only for those who can pay a couple of $100 for a weekend retreat. So that, you know, there has to be a basic standard of living, basic democracy, basic, you know, level of minimum wage, livable minimum wage. You know, all of these things have to be in place for Dharma to flourish. Honestly, I ask myself this question because I've had a long dialogue with a lot of men and some women who just don't believe that poor people deserve a livable wage and that women deserve equal access to Buddhism because they, as far as they're concerned, it's their karma. So let them suffer, let them eat cake. You know, but to me, I can't understand how to make these people have empathy. I'm just sad that they don't seem to have empathy, you know, and I wonder where their practice is at, you know. Like it's controversial to say, but it was a real revelation for me when this whole controversy with the monks in England who didn't want to fully ordain women, and that meant most of their female community left.
Yeah.
And I was still holding those monks in my mind with a lot of respect, and I still do. They did make inroads. They moved from the Meiji to the Siladhara, which was a big step because Meichis are still, for all intents and purposes, really just a lay person. Not a proper form of ordination. And one lady said to me, I said, well, maybe they're just a bit short-sighted, but, they're still very enlightened monks. And she said, are they? And I was like, it was like the scales came off my eyes, and I was like, well, actually, they're behaving in ways like men really don't like women and don't have empathy for them, and don't see their basic shared humanity. And I was like, wow, yeah, like their behavior. And it's not that we can't find legitimate scriptural foundations, which Bhikkhu Bodhi and Bhante Analayo have laid down,
Yes.
Bhante Sujato and Ajahn Brahms, like Pali scholars, they've literally said this can be done.
Yeah.
So it's not a scriptural or legalistic problem. It's a patriarchal problem, of people who don't want to share their space with women, because they might have issues around their own desire and they feel like Buddhism will decline. But look at all the controversies happening. Buddhism is already declining, and not because of what women are doing, but because what men are doing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a hard truth to acknowledge, but it's actually statistically true. It's not women raping and abusing students and, carrying out affairs with sex workers and embezzling money. It's not women doing that. It's men doing that mostly. And not to say all men are doing that. There are a lot of people with a lot of integrity, but it's men doing that. I can't say, that how to make those people have empathy. What I can say is maybe do some loving kindness meditation.
Yeah.
Maybe speak to people outside your circle of comfort and understand what their problems are. Like before I started the charity in India, just the poverty I saw in India really shocked me, and I realized these people that practice behind barbed wire fences in marble enclaves, in Buddhist monasteries and ashrams, with a guard out the front and barbed wire keeping the locals away. There were two worlds there. There was the air-conditioned ashram Buddhist world for foreigners or rich Indians, and then there's the world that the average Indian occupies, which is about survival. And I just thought, which side of the fence would the Buddha be on? And the things that I saw, I could not forget. And I just started to have empathy. Like it shocked me. We should all be shocked by seeing people in developed countries begging and living in tents, Yeah. We can send someone to the moon, but we can't feed our own people. Like we can't build enough houses. That's crazy. It's just like all our priorities are wrong, right? Yeah. Like you can spend $300 on some Asian lady's hair that you stick on your head and then take photos of yourself. But you can't... But, the people who are living in the park, like we can't think of giving them food. And what is our concept of beauty and love? Like, is wearing someone else's hair on your head real beauty, or is actually having a depth of character that you're concerned by the suffering of your fellow humans? I think we all need to develop empathy, and we need to reach beyond political lines, and we need to have conversations with people we don't agree with. And we need to understand their shared humanity and that they're not a threat to us. Someone who is different to us is not a threat to us. What is a threat to us is greed, hatred, and delusion. Not other, not different. Difference by itself is not a threat. What is a threat is, taking more than you need, and greed and bigotry. And the most dangerous of all is the dehumanizing of what we don't understand. We're estranged from our own goodness, and we're estranged from the sacredness. We're estranged from our own sacredness and our own peace, and we're estranged from the sacredness of the earth. So we carry out this kind of, and we consume because we feel empty inside. We take more than we need, and we destroy the planet, and we ignore each other because we feel numb and we feel estranged from love, from peace. So somehow we have to connect in with that basic love and that basic peace and that basic goodness and feel there is enough. And when we feel there is enough, we start to become part of a culture of nurturance rather than a culture of consumption. And we get our kicks from helping others and from, developing relationships with each other in the living world rather than individual, alone, pleasure seeking.
You touched base on this. Sometimes when I'm listening to you, I know that you're a Buddhist nun, and because I know you and you talk as a Buddhist nun, I would be interested for you to give us some insight on compassion in action. And does it have to be coming from a monastic setting? I mean, there's a lot of mindfulness movement that isn't monastic based and that has extracted the Buddha's teachings on mindfulness and has amplified it as being like as if it was the whole of the teachings. Now, in that discourse, there is very little that is being, spoken about in terms of other things that are part of the Buddha's teaching and how one has to, how we are interconnected, how compassion, all the paramis, all the qualities that we can develop. It's just mindfulness. Do you have anything to say about this? This disconnect between the secular and the non-secular, Dharma.
It's so controversial, isn't it?
Yes.
Because on one side, I can see that there are certain aspects of Buddhism that are not very palatable to the mainstream Western individual. So in a way, the secularization of certain aspects of Buddhism has spread Buddhism further. And many people have benefited from secular mindfulness. So it's not completely bad. And there are a lot of people with a lot of integrity doing that. And there are some people that are very money-oriented and profit-driven, which is kind of sad. You have to acknowledge there is a certain asset stripping going on with Buddhism in terms of the things like ethics, altruism, social responsibility, building community, building beloved community and compassionate action for justice, and accountability and the actual goal, the goal of liberation, rather than to just feel calm. All these things have been stripped out, and what is left is a little bit, it's a little bit watered down,
and it's going back to the self to look for it's going back to looking at the self and develop the self rather than trying to not to cling to the self and realize that there is no proper self. There is all of that is just construction. It's not something very solid. And as you say, there's a lot of value in the work that's being done, and there are lots of people with integrity looking at the microscope of one little thing and then making it enormous, which is not what Buddha spoke about. I mean, the Buddha or the Dharma in its entirety is just about the fact that there is no proper self there to be clinging and to be attached to. So all of that, whether secular or not secular, is just a bit more looking at what you can do for others, as well as, and as you say, go more into how are we connected and how the influence of my action have an impact on other action. At my own level, I don't think that any of us here has a way to change the whole overall, the whole function and greed that is ravaging the world. But we can do certain things at our own level. That's where I'm interested in, in my own area of influence, whether it is in the street, walking out in Bodh Gaya, or whether it is in Sydney, open the eyes, and instead of looking at the windows and the nice shiny product behind the windows, you can also see that there's someone there outside and sitting who has absolutely no interest in what's behind the window, because it just simply doesn't have the basic requisite to lead a proper life. In the recent years, it seems like the economic difficulties that household are experiencing is also impacting the way monasteries live. I don't know if you've noticed that it seems the level of generosity and the level of donation seem to have experienced a bit of a downturn. Have you observed that as well? So we are going. Yeah. And it has
the cost of food is double.
Yeah, it has an economic cause, obviously, but I guess I'm wondering whether there is a bit of overexposure, and why would I give to a monastic setting when I can actually give it to an NGO, a humanitarian organization who is working on disasters, or is more like ready action in terms of conflict, such as, it can be Palestine or other places. Why would I give to a monastic something that I can give to a lay organization? So you've experienced that. Have you observed that as well?
I have, yeah. I mean, the fact that my own monastery is not really financially viable, and that it took me 20 years to save enough money to buy it, and the fact that the charity I run in India earns 3 times as much as the monastery, because Westerners are geared towards understanding a material thing. Like if I give money to, bread to someone in a third world country, it's an actual benefit, whereas,
right,
supporting a monastery is more of an abstract thing. Like, what are they doing? They're not economically productive, so it's once again, it's a thing of you have to have a taste of freedom to appreciate the value of what people at monasteries are doing. Whereas if you've never been to a monastery, it's a bit hard to explain to people the value of that, But that doesn't mean there isn't value in that. And actually, as the world gets more busy and people are more overextended, living communally, like in a monastery, everything is shared.
Yep.
And, people have a very small environmental footprint. People live very simply, and there's a lot of beloved community. There's a lot in a good monastery. There's a lot of sharing, kindness, emotional support, friendship, less loneliness. There's a lot of things that people in monasteries do that are unseen, and how they hold space for community. Someone who is homeless, who has a church or a spiritual group that they go to, still has a network, and they find comfort, and they probably find help as well. So community in these times where things are so expensive and there is so much stress, there is even more need for those sacred places and that sense of community and emotional support,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's not to say that, NGOs don't also deserve support. But in terms of the whole mindfulness thing, I do think you can't take from the spring and poison the spring, Yeah, so you should acknowledge, like, okay, these teachings are derived. They may not be originally the same as, but they are derived from Buddhism. So if you want to go further, if you've been practicing mindfulness for years and you don't feel your practice is going anywhere, that may be because you have a jewel from what is actually a crown.
Mm.
So it's not just one jewel, it's actually a crown. And it's a complete path. It's not just about dealing with anxiety or feeling good in the short term. It's actually about complete liberation and radical compassion and transformation and ethics. So what you got there is one step on a whole path. So they should at least acknowledge this is where it comes from, and refer people back if they have deeper interests and questions, It's kind of another problem we have post-COVID is people don't want to come in person to a class. Like, people have become quite lazy in terms of turning up in person and in guidance from a teacher. But you literally, like, a book will never challenge your ego. A book will never point out your fault and tell you where you're going wrong. And there's no replacement for that face-to-face community support. And that's not to say that everybody in a community is easy to get on with, but that community support preserves Buddhism, keeps the teachings alive, creates, solidarity, and is really important. So also Dharma is not a product, and community is not expendable. It's not just a little video that you press when you feel a bit lonely. It's actually something that needs to be there for future generations and for a world that is increasingly in trouble. Mm-hmm. We actually do need to return to community support and solidarity and compassion and spiritual friendship, and beloved community.
Yes. And would you have anything to say about this chaplaincy, whether they're Christian, Catholic, or also Buddhism? Chaplaincy in prison, chaplaincy with the dying in the hospitals. That is something quite important in terms of opening the heart, in terms of compassion and empathy for us. Would you have anything to say about that, about the chaplaincy work?
I think if you're sick of seeing people in tents and you feel helpless because the politicians aren't listening, turn up to a soup kitchen once a month. Do something rather than just feeling helpless and doom scrolling as the world burns. Like, do something. Sponsor a child, go to a rally, change who you vote for. Help build a tiny home. Rent out your spare room. There are so many things all of us can do to make a better world, and chaplaincy outreach is really important. And also this idea that, that there is traditional Buddhism and then there is socially engaged Buddhism, I think is a bit of a myth as well, because monks and nuns, have always done counseling. People tell them their most intimate things and troubles, and they go to schools and they, hang out in nursing homes, and they do funerals and they do births, and they're part of the fabric of community.
Yes.
So, that chaplaincy is an extension of what monks and nuns and Buddhist communities have been doing all along. But it's really important, especially in America, when you've got this school to prison pipeline and just a lot of people in prison that really don't belong there.
Yep.
It can be such a depressing place, so to have the Dharma and just someone who listens and turns up is so meaningful. And I think we also need to do a bit more to be inclusive of children, because I think sometimes in Buddhism, people who have children feel like they've been shunned, because you had a child and it's too loud, so can you please take it somewhere else? They can't make it to Dharma class because they can't find a babysitter, and they can't breastfeed there, and it's like, well, can you get together with some other parents and share childcare while some of you come and sit, and can we have some Sunday schools in communities that have enough children to warrant that? Because if we don't have Sunday schools, if we don't engage children, they're not going to grow up Buddhist. They're going to forget what Buddhism is.
That's a powerful insight as well. But it just brings me to ask you another question. The world needs more Buddhist monastics. That's a really very plain statement. The world needs more Buddhist monastics. What do you think about that?
I do feel a little pessimistic about the future of monasticism, because I started the monastery and nobody's turning up, except like people with mental health issues and homeless people, who probably, and I'm talking about people in crisis, they're not doing well and they're really not in a position to become a spiritual teacher or a pillar of the community. They need basic services. So I feel, and the younger people, they're just so overextended in terms of student loans and working 3 jobs, and they don't seem very interested in monastic life.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I feel a little sad about that. I hope more people will come, or maybe I have to move to a more populated place. I mean, I would think that in a time where the cities are too expensive and life has become so stressful that actually coming and spending a year in a monastery and is actually a really appealing choice. But it seems like most of the people who want to ordain are retired, which is okay, but no community is viable if it only has older people. And they have, health issues and certain limitations that can make it hard to run a monastery, So you actually do need age diversity to make a community viable.
And this is what is not happening this has been my observation in the past few years that I spent in monasteries. It seems like age diversity is more common within male monastics communities than with women. Women tend to come to monasticism at a later time in their, they have had a life before. Rare are those who come and are just like 20, 22, 23. They tend to come later in their 30s, if not even later in their 40s. Compared men coming into monasticism, there's more of an inflow coming from the 20 years old, the very young one, sometimes without having any experience or exposure to life, but there's a sense of loss, and there's a sense of not knowing really what to do, and coming into monasticism, and actually it becomes almost as the traditional, how traditionally monasteries are run as a meetup, as a gompas, as a community center. They come there and they just basically learn to live. They learn to live communal living. They learn to cook. They learn to. But for women, it tends to be more. There are more constraints. Women don't tend to come earlier in their life, so I'm not sure if that.
The Plum Village tradition has a lot more young people turning up. I think part of it is you have to offer gender equality to be appealing to young people.
Do you think that is
another
why?
Thing? Yeah, I think that's not why a lot of them are not turning up at certain places, for sure. I think another factor is how frazzled they are as a generation in terms of their anxiety around climate change and despair and just struggling to pay the rent. Yeah. I think they're a lot more troubled because we're heading backwards, financially, economically, democratically. Like this generation actually have less rights and less resources than their parents and grandparents. And actually American women, their grandmothers had more rights than their granddaughters. Yeah. In terms of access to birth control and reproductive health and a living wage. So there's that. And it's also specific to the monastery. But I do agree generally that somehow something about, I feel like, millennials and Gen
Z.
Gen Z. The one Gen Y. They're a little more cynical about religion, so they're not as interested in Eastern religion and religion in general as boomers were. Boomers were very philosophical and fascinated by things from Eastern cultures. And another thing we're not doing right is, I literally met people who said to me, I didn't even know Buddhist nuns existed.
Oh,
so
wow.
That's another reason. But another factor is we don't have an alternative for non-binary and trans people. There are people who are non-binary and don't really fit within a male monastic sangha or a female monastic sangha. Yes. Or maybe, they're a trans male and the community won't accept them. So this is another thing we need to address, inclusivity. But I can't say for sure that I have a grip on why people aren't ordaining, apart from the general frazzledness of society that I see. And I feel like in future what we actually need is more bodhisattvas and social workers, because the whole world is headed towards something not very good, where we'll be just dealing with the survival of society as a whole rather than the sustainability of monasteries, We've got a generation of people talking about collapse, and where they'll live and how they'll survive when collapse happens. It's a troubled time we live in, but I can't say for sure that that I know, and maybe I need to talk more with Zoomers and see what it is that they want, and what they need.
So, Sandro, that brings me to ask you as a closing, I would say, as a closing moment for our conversation, the monastery you have established in Tasmania. Can you introduce us to that monastery?
Unlike a lot of male monasteries that have funding from Asian communities and are quite well funded, especially the Theravadan ones, nuns on the whole tend to have about only 20% of the support that male monasteries have. Yeah, financially it's pretty hard, and most of the support comes from online. It's a beautiful property, but it is a little remote. It's on an island at the bottom of Australia called Tasmania, and the next stop is Antarctica. It's wilderness. It's amazing and beautiful. It's 38 acres with 2 cabins and a house. But it is a bit away from like major cities. It's 1 hour from Launceston, which is a small city, and 3 hours from Hobart. But that's all I could afford at the time.
And it was
just so stunning.
Are you on your own?
Yeah, I am most of the time. I do get a lot of visitors, or some visitors in summer. Some of them are just like nature lovers who come and stay in a cabin and just, opt for a mindfulness class. Like I've literally had people in tears, so touched by a loving kindness meditation. So that's one pro of mindfulness, in the sense that mindfulness is now so widespread that people would feel very comfortable to say, yes, I'll do mindfulness. But if I said, do you want a Buddhist retreat? They'd be like, what's that? So I give I plant some little seeds, and some people come back and other people don't come back. But it's not growing as much as I'd hoped it would. Sometimes I think, maybe I should move to the mainland of Australia.
Are you connected with some of the other monasteries, whichever there are in Australia? I know that there is Ajahn Brahm, and how is Buddhism organized in Australia compared to what it is in Europe or in the US? Is there like a main organization? Do you have to register? Are you considered a charity? How does it work?
So there's no, fund, like there's no overhead control unless you belong to a particular lineage. And mostly Tibetan lamas are very sectarian and tend to remain just with their own students and not mix with other Tibetan Buddhist lineages. And because of everything that's going on in Tibetan Buddhism, I don't consider myself Tibetan Buddhist. Not that they ever did support me, even when I was an Orthodox member of their congregation. So I'm out on my own. The charity, the monastery is half owned privately by me because my family donated some money, and then half owned by the charity, by a spiritual organization.
A steward organization.
Called the Kalyana Mitra Fund. And there's just a few locals who come, and there's a few visitors from the mainland. And I do tours, I go where I'm invited to the mainland, and I sometimes go. I've been to Europe or I've been to America, and I hope to do more of that in the future. It is a little remote, but it is really stunning. So I'm a bit torn, like I love the property, and but I also feel like maybe I would be more useful on the mainland. But even the mainland, even as a nun with a monastery, you're still going to receive a lot less support and a lot less visitors than monks would, just because there is this kind of, I don't know, it's just a little bit harder for women unless you're particularly charismatic or you have a very famous teacher. It's just a bit more of a hard slog for women, I think. Yeah. But I hope that will change with time. And I'm very well known for the work I do in India. And people respond to that with more excitement. They seem to respond to that with more excitement.
So you will be coming to India, talking about India, you will be coming to India very soon, next week. And where will be your base in India? You'll be at the Bodhicitta Foundation?
Yeah, so Bodhicitta Foundation is a temple as well as many different decentralized rooms in slums. And the girls' home is a house that we rent. And we have a little temple as well. And gradually over time we're paying off land and so forth. But because there was this immediate need that we saw in Nagpur in central India, we've been renting for a long time. And the rents are going up quite a bit. So I'll go back to that place. We have 17 employees who are all very excited to see me, and there's a real sense of community there. And, we'll just, I give spiritual teachings there as well as overseeing all the social work. But, we have very capable staff who have worked for me for a long time and are very trusted. So it's just a matter of, just giving them a bit more juice and inspiration, to keep going and so forth. Like India is developing very fast, but it's getting very polluted, very overcrowded.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be severe droughts in future. So they also face, a lot of uncertainty. Yeah.
And you will be going to Nepal as well?
Just on a little pilgrimage with a few of my students, just for like a week or 10 days or something.
Okay. So I'm deeply always, even more than I was before, inspired by your work, by your the fluidity with which and your integrity definitely, but also the fluidity with which you blend the Dharma practice with everyday life and with the actual worldly considerations that we need to have to awaken from, in terms of where the world is going and how greed is still clinging on the minds of many. So I'm not going to speak too much. I don't want to be the last one to say something. I would like you to give us a really last insight on what can we do better. how can we be better persons with your own words before closing. Really, I'm really deeply inspired. Maybe I should come and have a visit to you, in Tasmania. I'm sure you're doing a lot that we don't know about. But definitely what we know about you is that there definitely transpires integrity and a great sense of service to others with a very proper focus. It's not just service for the sake of service. It's really with a proper rationale and focus. So please, I leave it on to you to close this. Insights, remarks, comments, reflections. Go ahead.
So I think there is this, we do live in troubled times, and there is this tendency to bury yourself in distraction to avoid feeling the pain and uncertainty of these times. But I think it's really important to take refuge in cultivating some inner peace and goodness and clarity, because there is a part of you that has never been born and will never die, and that is at the core of what it is to be human, a potential for awakening, for peace, and touch that peace within yourself. And having touched that peace and goodness, then take that out into the world and create a sense of solidarity. Like, if you're, don't just look for love, but start giving love, and start in small ways. Look at what you're interested in terms of the field of altruism, little ways that you could make a difference. Even if it's just visiting some older people who are lonely in the community, there's just so many things that can be done, so many ways to manifest solidarity and create a better world, even if it starts with small things. Because I think we all need to be part of the change we want to see, rather than feeling helpless that the people in power have failed us and there's nothing we can do and we should just be distracted until the world goes to the dogs. You know, just even if we can't make miracles, we can come together as community. We can let people that are falling through the cracks know that we care. But to make that activism sustainable, we do need an inner refuge. We do need to commune with nature. We do need to take time off work to pursue things that nourish our spirit, like something like art or, pilgrimage or walking, doing things that nourish you, self-care, but not in a narcissistic way, having a rich spiritual practice and having a sense of refuge in community, turning up to community, but nourishing that inner strength and resilience, even though the world is troubled. So dig your roots deep and let your branches offer shade to others.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much, Ayya. It was really heart-opening, even more, considering that I'm in Bodh Gaya at the moment. Having you online is just matching the purpose as to why I'm here. Thank you for giving us the chance to chat with you. And may you be well, and may you have a safe journey to India.
May you also be well, dear sister.
Yeah. Thank you, Ayya.